Prologue Scene 1. The Hollow at Night. The thing about Deadman's Hollow was that it was never quiet in the same way twice. Herald McKinnon had been walking this ground for longer than the oldest trees here had been standing, and he had learned to read the silences the way a man reads weather. Some silences were empty, some were full of the wrong things. Tonight was the third kind. He stopped at the tree line and stood without moving for a moment. Roy at his shoulder with the flashlight held low, its beam aimed at the ground between them rather than into the dark ahead. Roy knew better than to cut the light forward until Herald was ready. He had learned this the second time out, back in 1981, when his instinct to illuminate had cost them both a week of bad sleep. He did not make that mistake anymore. Herald listened. October had stripped most of the leaves by now, and what remained hung brown and reluctant on the beeches and the oaks, the kind of leaves that held on past the point of usefulness, past the point of colour, past everything except the bare fact of still being attached. The wind was low tonight, barely enough to move them. The sky was clear. A near full moon sat above the ridgeline and cast the hollow below in pale silver light that made everything look slightly wrong. The shadows black and absolute, the spaces between the trees, all depth and no definition. The creek was not running. That was the first thing. Nakin Creek came through the lower end of Deadman's Hollow on its way south, and in October it ran reduced, summer's flow long gone, the stones in its bed showing through 6 inches of cold clear water. Herald could hear it from here on most nights, a low background sound, the water moving over the rocks with the indifference of water moving over rocks. He was not hearing it now. The creek did not stop running. He had never known it to stop. Different, Roy said. Herald did not respond. Roy had timed the word the way he timed most things, after he had decided it was necessary and not before. That was his method. Assessment first, then speech. Never the other way. Yes, Herald said. He stepped forward into the hollow. The descent was gradual at first, the tree line yielding to the bowl-shaped depression that the old maps called Grayson Hollow, and that locals had called Deadman's for 30 years, since the third child went missing in the spring of 1968, and the name arrived informally and then permanently, the way a stain settles into fabric. The ground underfoot had the wrong kind of softness, the kind that had nothing to do with rain. Not mud, not rot. The other kind of soft, the kind that meant the earth itself was slightly wrong, slightly too present, as if you had the attention of something that lived deep and did not usually bother with the surface. Herald read it without naming it. He had been in this hollow more times than he could accurately count, working the line he had held alone since 1973, when the other guardians had looked at the mathematics and decided the old places were too deep to contest. Too old and too strong, and had gone elsewhere, or gone dark, or simply stopped. Herald had not argued with them. The mathematics were correct. It was the conclusion he disagreed with. Some things, he had found, did not respond to mathematics. Roy matched his pace 3 steps behind, flashlight still aimed down, the beam moving across the ground between them and showing Herald what he needed to see. Footprints from last week's visit, now softened by light rain and the slow compression of days. The bare root systems of the oaks they had been past before, familiar as furniture. And then 50 yards in, not familiar. The leaves. The leaves on the ground at the base of the oaks were arranged wrong, not wind wrong, not rain wrong. Swept. Herald stopped and crouched without speaking and looked at the pattern for a moment. The leaves had been moved in arcs, radiating outward from a common center, the kind of pattern a thing makes when it has been standing in one place and turning, slowly, taking stock of everything in every direction. The center of the pattern was on the path between the tree line and the root cellar. Something's been here, Roy said. Something's been here recently, Herald said. He straightened. More than one visit. Roy did not say anything else. That was what Herald valued most in him, the thing that had turned his persistence from an inconvenience into something actually useful. Roy knew when the observation had been made completely. Herald started walking again. The root cellar came into view at 50 yards, a dark rectangle at the base of the slope where the bowl of the hollow flattened out, its stone steps going down into a darkness that the moonlight did not reach. A rusted iron latch on the wooden hatch. Timber frame around the opening, old growth that had been here long before Thomas Grayson built on this land, long before his house burned down around him in 1952, and left him to whatever the dark places had made of him across the decades since. Herald stopped 20 feet from the opening. The Grayson creature had not been above ground since August. Their last visit, 6 weeks ago, had found the hatch closed, the ground undisturbed, the cellar quiet in the way it went quiet when the thing inside it was dormant, settled back into whatever passed for rest in something like Thomas Grayson. He had not been a good man alive. He was something considerably worse dead, and whatever the Hollow had been doing to him in the years since his death had been working steadily and in one direction. Now, the hatch was not closed. It was open 3 inches, the rusted latch hanging loose, the darkness below showing as a thin black line at the gap. The kind of opening that had been made carefully, deliberately from below. He's been out. Roy did not look at the hatch when he said it. He's out now, Herald said. Stay close. The temperature dropped 15 degrees between one breath and the next. Not weather, not the wind. The Hollow, paying attention. Roy put his right hand in his coat pocket without being told. Herald kept his eyes on the tree line to the left. The movement when it came was from the right. Prologue Scene 2. The Grayson creature. It came up from the slope rather than from the cellar, which told Herald something he filed away without reacting to. It had gone down through the hatch and come up through the ground itself, through the network of root chambers and collapsed tunnels that the Hollow had been building for it across 36 years of occupation. A creature did not manage that kind of movement in its first years beneath the ground. A creature managed it when it had been learning the architecture of the place it inhabited for a long time, and the place had been teaching it in return. The Grayson creature was stronger than it had been in August. Herald had measured it across every encounter since October of 1971, when he had first found Emma Brennan at the top of those cellar steps, and he knew what it wanted. What it had always wanted. The fear of innocence, encountering something it had no framework for. Thomas Grayson had fed on that in life. He fed on it in death, in the way things that are given to excess in life tend to carry the excess with them into whatever comes after. It came out of the slope 20 yards to his right, pulling itself upright with a movement that was almost human, and stopped being human, right at the point where the shoulders settled, limbs that stretched too long. Joints that articulated in directions the body was not built for, a fluid wrongness in every angle, the darkness pooled in the hollows of the face where the eyes were not eyes, but the absence where eyes should have been. Black voids that the moonlight passed over without catching. It turned toward Herald. It knew him. 40 years of encounters across the line, where what Herald was met, what the Grayson creature had become. And in that time, they had arrived at a working understanding of each other's edges. The creature knew Herald would drive it back. Herald knew driving it back was not the same as ending it. The creature was not capable of being ended, not with what Herald had available, and he had accepted this the way a man accepts that certain problems cannot be solved, only managed. He had been managing it since 1971, and would be managing it past tonight. And both of them understood this without discussion. What was different about tonight was the energy. Herald carried a length of iron in his right hand, a flat bar smooth from decades of handling, its weight familiar in the way that tools become familiar through long use, where the weight stops registering consciously and becomes simply part of the hand. He raised it. The creature did not back away. That was different. In the past 2 years, it had learned to track the iron's presence and adjust accordingly, not retreat exactly, but recalibrate. Give ground on the side where the iron was while pressing on the other side. A tactical response. The kind of response that meant it had learned. Tonight, it stood where it was. Herald stepped toward it. It opened its mouth. The sound that came out was not language and was not entirely not language, the way the sounds in this hollow were rarely any one clean category. A resonance. A wet vibration at the back of something that no longer had a throat, in the sense that living things had throats. And beneath that sound, under it, almost but not quite recognizable, words. Herald had heard the Grayson creature speak before. It spoke the way it moved, in something that was almost the pattern of human communication, and then wrong at every point of execution. It said the names of children who had been near the hollow. It said things a dead man might still carry, fragments of memory that had survived the dying and the darkening. Things Thomas Grayson had known in life that came out now warped by whatever 40 years in the dark had done to the shape of his consciousness. It had never said anything about Ironwood. The old place on the Ridge Road, it said, or something enough like that Herald understood it, the words surfacing through the resonance, the way things sometimes surface through dark water, indistinct until they were not. Where the horseshoes are. Where the horseshoes were. Herald moved forward with the iron. The creature swung at him. Not a glancing blow, not the testing swipe he had fielded 100 times in this hollow. A genuine swing, the impossibly long arm coming around with speed and force that it had not possessed in August. He got the iron bar up in time, and the creature's hand connected with it, and the sound it made was wrong. The sound of contact between two things that should not have been touching. And then the creature was scrambling sideways, a hiss escaping it, black ichor at the knuckles where the iron had found skin. Roy moved to Herald's left without being asked, keeping his position, keeping the flashlight steady on the creature's midsection. He knew not to aim it at the eyes. He had learned that specifically. The creature stopped and turned and looked at Herald from 12 feet away. Where the horseshoes were, it said again, more clearly this time, the dead man's voice finding something like focus. One of them gone quiet. One of them already gone. It came and it looked, and it is coming back. Do you know what comes back when it comes back? Do you know what it does to the places that tried to hold it? Herald advanced. The creature retreated, finally, the way it always retreated, not in fear, but in the calculation that the cost of continued contact with the iron exceeded what it was here to do tonight. It moved back toward the cellar, its joints folding in their wrong directions, the moonlight catching the wet mark of ichor on the stone lip of the opening as it descended. At the edge of the hatch it stopped. A letter, it said. A letter from the Ridge Road. It knows about the letter. It knew before the ink dried. Then it went down. Herald stood at the opening for a moment, and then lowered the iron bar and looked at the darkness below without expression. The hatch was open. He did not close it. He had learned early that closing the hatch accomplished nothing except giving the creature something to open, and the process of opening it was something he preferred not to make habitual. He left it as the creature had left it and turned back toward Roy. Roy was recording something in his notebook. The blue mead cover, this year's installment, his precise mortician's hand moving across the page in the flashlight's edge. Date, time, description. He did not look up from the page. That was new, Roy said. The strength was new, Herald said. The rest of it we should discuss on the way out. Roy closed the notebook and they walked. Prologue Scene 3. Walking Out. The path out of Deadman's Hollow ran north through the trees, following the original deer track that the county had never bothered to improve because the county had been persuaded in 1952 by a complicated sequence of events to stop sending people into this particular stretch of woodland, and had quietly maintained that unofficial policy ever since. The trees on either side were heavy second growth, oak and beech, and the occasional black walnut, their trunks thick enough to be old. They stood motionless in the low wind. The creek had come back. Herald could hear it again, the low sound of water moving over stones in the lower end of the hollow behind them, its normal fall-season register, reduced but present. It had started again at the moment the Grayson creature descended. He noted this. The creek was not stopping for Thomas Grayson, whatever the creature was becoming. It was stopping for something the creature was reflecting. How much stronger? Roy said. He had been walking in silence for 4 minutes, which for Roy meant he had been assembling the question carefully, measurably. Since August. Yes. Roy considered this for a moment. The uptick in calls this fall. The Brannigan place out on County Road 14. The thing the Haverford woman reported in her barn, I thought those were unrelated. They may not be. Roy turned this over. Something is feeding the old places, making the things in them stronger. Harold said nothing. That's what you've been thinking since before we came in tonight, Roy said. That's why you wanted to come back out here, even after the season turned. Harold said nothing. Harold. Ask what you're actually asking, Harold said. Roy was quiet for 3 more strides. The tree line was ahead of them, the county road beyond it, the pale bulk of Roy's Buick parked on the gravel shoulder, where he'd left it 2 hours ago, with the doors unlocked, because nobody had ever broken into a car on this road, and nobody was going to start tonight. Frank Harmon's letter, Roy said. What exactly does it say? Harold reached into his coat pocket and brought out the envelope. He had read it twice. He did not need to read it again, but he unfolded it anyway and held it in the flashlight beam as they walked. Because Roy had not read it, and Roy had a right to read it, and Roy would have asked for it directly, but that was not Roy's method. Roy asked for the information and let you determine the form. The letter was 3 paragraphs in Frank Harmon's handwriting, close printed and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who chose his words before he put them on the page. He read it aloud. The first paragraph was an account of what had happened in October, the Dark Entity's visit. Frank's spare accounting of it, without drama, the way a man described a thing he needed someone to understand before he could explain why he was writing. The horseshoe above the lodge door, the coffee mug frosting from the outside. The hands, the way Frank described them, impossibly long, each joint bending backward. The 2 voids where a face would have been on anything with a right to one. The communication that was not speech. What the communication contained. Roy did not say anything during this paragraph. The second paragraph was Frank's assessment. He had held the watch alone for 10 years. He had the records his father kept, the old accounts, the accumulated observations going back further than either of them had been alive. He knew what the Dark Entity's visit meant in the context of those records. He was not writing from panic. He was writing because the calculation had changed in a way he did not have the resources to address alone, and he had not wanted to write this letter for 15 months, since the boy had survived the spring maintenance in March of 1985, and he should have written it then. He was writing it now. Roy said, "The boy." "Wait," Harold said. The third paragraph was 2 sentences. "I believe you wrote to me in March of 1985 about the Anderson boy." I should have written back. Harold folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. They had reached the tree line. The county road opened up ahead of them, flat asphalt and pale gravel shoulder, the car sitting where they'd left it. Roy clicked off the flashlight. The moon was sufficient out here, away from the Hollow's particular appetite for light. Roy stood at the car door without opening it. "He's been watching the Hollow alone for 10 years, Roy said. "Since he was, 46? "Yes, 46, Harold said. "And the Dark Entity came to Ironwood in October and killed a ward and told him the game had started, and he sat on that for 2 weeks before writing to you." 3 weeks? Roy looked at him. "You already knew, before the letter." "I had been sensing the shift at Ironwood for longer than that," Harold said. Something in the quality of what moves through Grindstone Hollow. Something oriented. Something that knew where it was going. And the Grayson creature just told you it knew about Frank's letter before the ink dried. Yes, so it's already listening to everything in the county. It has been listening to everything in this county for longer than either of us can account for, Harold said. What's changed is the direction it's listening. Roy opened the car door and stood behind it for a moment, not getting in. "Michael Anderson," he said. "Yes, the notation in your journal, the one I saw 3 years ago. Anderson boy, marked. I never asked you about it." "No, I'm asking now." Harold looked at him across the roof of the car in the moonlight. Roy had been at his side for 9 years, through more encounters in more dark places than either of them could reconstruct from memory alone, and in 9 years he had asked questions only when the information was operationally necessary. He had decided this information was operationally necessary. Harold said, "He survived something at age 10 that should have killed him. Not survived it by accident, and not survived it because nothing was seriously intended. He survived it because something in him held. I do not know yet what that something is. What I know is that the dark entity came to Ironwood to announce that the game has started, and the game is specifically about that boy. And Frank Harmon has been watching him from a distance for 3 years since the spring maintenance and has done nothing, and I have been watching from further than that, and that cannot continue. Roy was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. He got in the car. Harold got in the passenger side. Roy started the engine. The Buick's heater made its usual complaint about being asked to operate in October and then settled into its job. Neither of them spoke on the drive back through Willow's Bend. There was not much left to say tonight. They both understood where the information pointed. The question of what to do with where it pointed was a question for after Harold had been to Ironwood, had stood in the place itself, and read what needed reading. Some assessments could only be made from inside the geography. Roy dropped him at the farmhouse on Maple Grove Road and waited until Harold was through the front door before pulling away. That was Roy's habit. Harold had not asked him to maintain it and had never commented on it, but it was the kind of thing a man did when he had decided, without ceremony and without being asked, that the person he was responsible to would have his back covered as long as it was possible to cover it. The porch light was on. It was always on when Harold came home late. Prologue Scene 4. The Decision. The pound cake was on the counter. Margaret had not been told Roy was coming. Roy had not been to the house since September. The pound cake was not there because Margaret had calculated the likelihood of Roy's presence. It was there because Margaret had made her own calculation about what tonight was and what it would cost. And the pound cake was her answer to that calculation, the thing she knew to put in place when the work came home with Harold, in a way that would spill over into the kitchen. She was in the front room with her reading glasses on, and her library book open across her knee. The lamp at the right angle, the way she read when she intended to be up when he came in. She looked up when he came through the door, and looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 31 years. With the particular directness of a woman who had a long time ago decided she would see things clearly regardless of whether they were comfortable to see. "Bad," she said. "Not simple," Harold said. He hung his coat on the peg by the door. She watched him do it with the book still open across her knee. "Not reading." "Thomas Grayson was stronger," she said. "Not a question." Significantly. "And you think you know why?" He came through to the kitchen and cut 2 slices of the pound cake, thick ones, the way she had always made it, butter and a little more vanilla than the recipe called for, the same way his mother had made it before her and her mother before that, a recipe that had travelled further than anyone in the family had thought to track. He brought a plate back to the front room and set it on the end table beside her chair. She had closed the book. He sat across from her in his thinking chair, not the couch. She knew the difference. "Frank Harmon wrote," he said. "I know. I saw the envelope when you brought it in. He should have written 3 years ago, but he didn't, and now he has." Margaret set her glasses on top of the closed book. "What does it say?" He told her what the letter said. He had told her enough about Ironwood to understand the geography of his work, the territory he covered, the particular character of what Grindstone Hollow held versus what Deadman's Hollow held versus the other places he maintained across Wawaset County. She had absorbed this the way Margaret absorbed most things, practically and without theatre. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, she reached over and took the slice of pound cake from the plate and ate a bite of it and looked at the wall for a moment. "You've already decided," she said. "I should go to Ironwood." "Yes." She took another bite. Before that man spends another winter alone with something he doesn't fully understand, working against everything he's built. Harold looked at her. "He sounds like a man who's been holding on past the point of holding on being a reasonable thing to ask of one person," she said. "And I have some experience recognizing that." He did not answer this. He did not need to. "How long?" she said. "A few days to start, longer if the assessment requires it." I'll call the Hendersons about the firewood. You won't be here to stack it, and it needs to be in before December." She stood and picked up the plate and the glasses and the book. "You should sleep before you go. You won't, but you should." She went to the kitchen. He heard the plate go into the sink, the water running briefly, the small sounds of a woman ending her evening without wasting emotion on it. She came back to the doorway. "Be careful with Frank Harmon," she said. "A man who has held that kind of watch alone that long doesn't easily accept help. He'll receive it and resist it at the same time, and consider that a reasonable position." Herald said, "I know." "I know you know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." She turned off the front room lamp and left him in the partial dark with the cake on the end table and the coat on the peg by the door. He sat in the chair for a long time. The house was still around him. The house on Maple Grove Road where he had lived with Margaret for 31 years, the blue house with the woodpile in the back, and the good oak chopping block, and the porch light that she left on when he came home late. The things in this house were specific and known, and the way a home becomes a man's when he has lived in it long enough to stop seeing it and start feeling it. The distance behind him, where the starting was, and the distance ahead where the stopping would be, or would not be, depending on what he was. He went upstairs. He did not sleep. Before 4 in the morning, he had his bag packed, the one he kept at the back of the closet for situations that required travelling. He went quietly so as not to wake Margaret, a courtesy she appreciated without requiring. She slept how she chose to sleep. She always had. The wagon was already warm when he backed it out of the drive. The late 1970s Chevrolet Caprice estate wagon, faded paint and wood grain paneling, its aged exterior telling a story about the years it had accumulated that the engine told nothing about. The engine was perfect. It had always been perfect. It would continue to be perfect for reasons that had nothing to do with maintenance schedules. And the men at the garage on Vine Street had stopped asking questions about it years ago because no answer he had given them had been satisfying. And eventually, a man stops asking questions he does not expect satisfying answers to. He drove south out of Willow's Bend in the dark before dawn, the road empty at this hour, the county sleeping around him. He thought about Frank Harmon. He thought about Michael Anderson, 20 years old, working a factory line outside Willow's Bend, and carrying something he did not yet know how to name. Something that had come into focus in March of 1985, when the boy had stood in that hollow with dead things pressing against every door, and had held. He thought about Frank's letter, the precise reluctant handwriting, the 2 final sentences. "I believe you wrote to me in March of 1985 about the Anderson boy." I should have written back. 3 years. Herald turned onto Maple Grove Road. Ironwood was 8 miles up. He would be there in 10 minutes. Ahead, somewhere in the geography of Grindstone Hollow, he had kept his distance from for a decade, trusting Frank to hold it. Something had shifted. Something was waiting. Something that had come to an outpost at the edge of its territory 3 weeks ago and delivered a message to a man who was sitting alone at his desk right now writing letters. Herald drove toward it. Chapter 1, Scene 1. Frank's morning. Frank had been making his coffee the same way for 30 years, and he did not consider this a virtue. It was a practice. He ground the beans by hand, the manual mill his father had bought in 1960, that was still the best piece of equipment in the lodge kitchen, filled the percolator, put it on the range at medium heat. By the time he finished his morning check, the coffee would be ready. First cup at the counter, looking out at the gravel drive. Second cup in the front room, thinking about what the day required. The second cup was longer in coming this morning. He had been at the front window since 5:30. The sky was doing what November skies did here, grading from black into a flat pewter overcast, the cloud cover sitting low enough to feel like a ceiling. The hollow was visible from the front window, the tree line 50 yards out, the dead grass of the compound between the lodge and the units showing silver in the morning light. Everything was quiet. Everything had been quiet since October. He was not relieved by this. He had lived at Ironwood for enough years to understand what the hollow's quiet meant. And the quiet since the dark entity's visit was not the watchful quiet he had learned to read across a decade of keeping the watch. It was not the silence of a thing observing and waiting. It was something different, a retraction, a pause between movements. The anticipation he had felt in October had not gone anywhere. It had settled into the quality of the air, the way certain smells settled into old wood, not visible, not immediately apparent, but present, a background texture to everything the hollow was doing and not doing. Frank had noticed it first in the horseshoes. The 9 functioning wards had not gone cold the way Units 9 and 10 had gone cold in October, but they were running different, lower. As if the mechanism that operated them was drawing more power than usual to maintain the baseline, like a space heater running at the same setting in a colder room. He pulled on his coat and went out. The November air was sharp in the way Ohio November air was sharp, not bitter yet, not the deep cold of January, but with an edge to it that meant what it said. His breath came out in a steady drift of vapor that the still air held in place for a moment before dispersing. He could hear the hollow. The creek was running its winter register, slow and cold in its bed south of the fence line. The trees were bare, the canopy gone, and the sky was visible through the branches in the way it was only visible in November, and then again in March, the bare months. He walked the first row. Units 1 through 5, all empty, all dark, horseshoes above each door. He did not stop at each one, did not put his palm to each piece of iron. He had been doing this walk long enough to know which units needed a close look and which ones he could read from the corner of his eye. All 5 of the first row were presenting normally, the iron at its correct temperature, the wards doing their work on nothing in particular. He crossed to the second row, Units 6 through 10, the north end. The 2 on the far end, 9 and 10, were still cold. Not cold the way they'd been cold in October, the battery-drained cold of iron that had been pressed against something massive and come up empty. The ordinary cold of November metal. But they had not come back up to full operating temperature either, and he had been watching them for 3 weeks, and they had not changed. He did not know what that meant. He was beginning to think it meant the proximity of the dark entity's visit had left a residue in the iron that would not clear on its own. He had not replaced the horseshoe above the lodge door. He stood at the door and looked up at it every morning. And every morning he made the same decision to leave it where it was, and he could not entirely articulate why, except that it felt true. The dead iron was information. It was a record of what had come here. Replacing it would be pretending that the record did not exist, and Frank Harmon had stopped pretending about things in this hollow around year 3 of keeping the watch, when he had understood that pretending accomplished nothing and accurate accounting was all that actually served the work. The dead iron above the door was accurate accounting. He stood on the porch with his coffee and looked at the gravel drive. He had written to Herald McKinnon 3 weeks ago. He had not heard back. This was not a surprise. A letter to Willow's Bend took 2 days each direction. Herald was not a man who wrote quick answers to complicated letters. And even if he had, Frank was not sure what he expected the answer to contain. He expected it would contain Herald McKinnon coming to Ironwood. He could not have explained why he expected this. Something in Herald's 4 sentences, the way they said exactly what needed saying and nothing else. The sentences had told him something about Herald McKinnon that the man's reputation had not fully conveyed. And what they had told him was that Herald was a man who moved rather than considered moving, who had been moving toward this conversation since 1985, and had simply been waiting for Frank to be ready to have it. Whether Frank was ready was a separate question. He drank his coffee. The hollow was quiet around him, its November quiet, the bare trees and the cold creek and the pale sky doing what they did. Ironwood sat in its natural basin, the 2 rows of units, the lodge, the fence line, the gravel drive running out to Maple Grove Road, a 1/4 mile through the trees. He had built his life around this place, the way a man builds around a responsibility he accepted before he understood its full weight. And the responsibility had shaped him the way responsibilities do, until there was not much of him that existed separate from it. His father had built Ironwood. His father had passed it to him. His father had died 10 years ago, and Frank had been keeping the watch since, alone. And the aloneness had been a fact of the work that he had not examined closely, because examining it would have required acknowledging that the mathematics of one man against what the hollow held were going in the wrong direction. The dark entity had not killed a ward from outside the fence. It had come through the fence and killed it from inside the lodge. That was the mathematics Frank had been sitting with for 3 weeks. He finished his coffee, washed the mug, and went to his desk. The drawer held his father's stack of Herald McKinnon cards, the ones Frank had been putting in guest rooms for a decade. They were copies. The original was in the back of the drawer, his father's, and Frank had not given it away and did not intend to. He opened the drawer. The card was there. Herald McKinnon. A Willow's Bend address and a phone number. No title, no description. His father had carried this card for years and had never fully explained where he'd gotten it or what the transaction had been that accompanied it. And Frank had stopped trying to find the explanation in the records because the records did not contain it. Some arrangements predated the record keeping. He closed the drawer without touching the card. He went back to the front window, and then, at 8:30, he heard the sound of an engine on Maple Grove Road. Chapter 1, Scene 2. The car on the drive. The sound of an engine on Maple Grove Road was not unusual. It was a county road, paved in 1961, and local traffic moved on it regularly enough that Frank had long since trained himself to register the sound without responding to it. The school bus in the morning. The dairy truck twice a week. The occasional farm truck from the Hendersons, who ran the property at the north end of the road. He registered this engine and kept registering it. It did not pass. It turned. The sound of tires on gravel came through the front window glass, and Frank was already at the window before he had consciously decided to move. The drive through the trees was not quite visible from this angle until a car was 70 yards in, when the aspens thinned out and the view to the road opened up. He stood at the window and watched the point where the drive emerged from the aspens. The car that came through was a late 1970s Chevrolet Caprice estate wagon. Frank looked at it. It was faded in the particular way that cars fade when they have been driven in all seasons, without significant concession to the elements. The dark colour gone chalky at the roof, and the hood where the paint had been working against the sun for years. Wood grain panelling on the doors and the rear quarter, years past fashionable, the kind of car a man drove because it was his car, and that was the end of the discussion. It moved up the drive at a pace that was not quite slow and was not quite normal, something in between, as if the driver were taking in the geography as he came through it, rather than simply coming through it. It parked beside the lodge without being told where to park. The engine stopped. The man who got out was not what Frank had expected, or he was precisely what Frank had expected. And the difference between those two things was the difference between what you anticipated intellectually and what you recognized viscerally. He was not young, and he was not old. He was average height. He was wearing a coat that was not quite warm enough for November, in a way that suggested November had no particular opinion on the matter. He moved across the gravel between the car and the lodge with a deliberateness that was not slow, but was not hurried. The deliberateness of a man who knew exactly how much time he needed and had calculated nothing extra into it. He looked at the front of the lodge. Not at Frank, who was still at the window. At the lodge. At the porch. At the door. At the horseshoe above the door. He looked at the dead horseshoe for 5 full seconds without expression. Then he looked at the window and found Frank there, and the two of them regarded each other through the glass for a moment, and then Frank went to the door and opened it. The man on the porch looked at him with eyes that were the colour of old creek water, that particular brown-grey of clear water running over stone in November when the light was flat, eyes that registered what they looked at with a quality of attention that Frank associated with men who had been reading difficult situations for a long time and had learned to see past the surface presentation to what was underneath. "Frank Harmon," the man said. "Herald McKinnon," Frank said. They looked at each other. Harold's gaze went back to the horseshoe above the door, a brief glance, and then returned to Frank. "Tell me about it inside," he said. Frank stepped back to let him in. Chapter 1, Scene 3. The Lodge. The lodge kitchen was the room where Frank did his actual thinking, which was why he kept it spare. A table with 4 chairs, the range, the percolator, the window above the sink looking out toward the tree line, the counter his father had built from oak boards that were now 50 years old, and showed it. He brought the percolator to the table, poured 2 cups without asking, and sat down across from Harold. Harold sat. He had not removed his coat. He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table between them for a moment, and Frank understood from this that Harold was in the process of assembling something, not delay exactly, but the particular internal action of a man who had more information than he intended to share and was deciding what to lead with. Frank did not press him. He let the coffee steam between them and waited. "The Grayson creature," Harold said finally. "In Deadman's Hollow. 2 nights ago." "I don't know the Grayson creature." "You wouldn't. It's in Deadman's Hollow, not here." Harold looked at the window, then back. "Thomas Grayson died in 1952 when his house burned on the Ridge Road, has been in the cellar under the old Grayson property since approximately 1955. I have been managing it since 1971, Frank said. "Managing. Driving it back. It cannot be ended with what I have available. It can be kept below ground most of the time." Harold's hands moved slightly on the cup. 2 nights ago, it was stronger than it has been at any point in 17 years of encounters. Significantly stronger. And it said something. Frank waited. It said something about the hollow on the Ridge Road. About the horseshoes. Harold paused. About one of them having gone quiet. The quiet between them after that was specific. Frank felt it the way he felt the hollow's particular silences, as information. "Come with me," he said. He took the coffee to the front room. Harold followed. Frank stood below the front door and looked up at the horseshoe, and Harold came to stand beside him and looked at it too. Frank said, "That was there from the day my father hung the wards in 1976. 12 years. It ran like the others. It ran like the others until October 15th of this year, and then it didn't." Harold looked at the dead iron without touching it. "You left it," Harold said. "Yes." "Good." Harold turned back toward the kitchen. "Tell me what came." They sat back down. Frank told him what came. He told it the way he had told it in the letter. Spare, factual, the sequence of events across that October morning in the order they occurred. The temperature, the frost on the coffee mug, the darkness accumulating in the corners of the lodge in a way that was not how darkness in this lodge behaved. The hands. He described the hands because the hands were the piece he could not get out of his own memory. The impossibly long fingers, the backward articulation of each joint, the skin the color of curdled milk over the shifting bones beneath it. He described the 2 voids where a face would have been on anything with a right to one. He described the communication. He had sat at his desk afterward and written down what he understood the communication to contain, because memory was unreliable after encounters with the hollow's manifestations, the details sliding and reshaping themselves in the hours after, and he had wanted the accurate accounting on paper before it had a chance to slide. He had the paper. He took it from the desk drawer and read from it, not from memory. The communication, the game has begun. The confrontation is already shaped and moving. The boy marked in a haunting that started in 1977. The people who would stand in this fight would die. He put the paper down. Harold looked at it. He did not pick it up. "The Grayson creature," Harold said, used the word letter. It said the dark entity knew about the letter before the ink dried. Frank absorbed this. "It's listening to the county," he said. "It has been listening to this county since before your father built Ironwood," Harold said. "What has changed is the orientation of what it's listening for. It came to Ironwood to make an announcement. Every piece of this county that is capable of conducting information is now conducting it back to whatever the dark entity uses for attention. Deadman's Hollow is conducting it. The Grayson creature is conducting it. Every old place I have been maintaining on a solo basis for 15 years is conducting it." Frank was quiet. How bad? He said finally. It was not quite a question. Herald looked at him. The ward above your door did not fail, Herald said. It was erased. I want to make sure you understand the distinction. A ward fails when the thing pressing against it exceeds the ward's capacity. The iron drains, the protection diminishes, the thing gets through. That is a failure of degree. What happened above your door is different. The dark entity stood in this room, and it reached up and it took everything the ward carried and it removed it, not displaced, not overwhelmed, removed. The iron is still iron. It will never again be a ward. Frank said nothing. In 40 years of working the guardian practices my father passed to me, Herald said, I have never seen a ward erased. I have seen wards fail. I have seen wards drained. I have never seen one taken apart the way you take apart a thing you want to make a point about. The coffee was no longer steaming between them. Frank looked at the cup and then looked at the window. You said the game has started, he said. The dark entity said it. And it said Michael Anderson is what the game is about. It communicated it without speaking, Frank said. My words, my accounting. I'm not certain I have the right vocabulary. You have the right vocabulary, Herald said. The vocabulary is accurate. Frank put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. 56 years of working hands, a decade of working them in this particular geography, the specific wear of the compound maintenance and the iron handling and the late nights and the early mornings, all of it accumulated in the specific texture of the skin across his knuckles. I've been keeping this watch alone for 10 years, Frank said. I know. I should have written you in 1985. Yes, Herald said. The directness of it landed without cruelty. Frank had expected some accommodation of the statement, some softening of the yes into something less stark. Herald did not offer that, and Frank understood that he would not, and found to his own surprise that he preferred it. What do you need to see? Frank said. Herald stood. The perimeter. Chapter 1, Scene 4. The fence line. Ironwood's perimeter fence ran a quarter-mile on each side, chain link with iron posts. The posts his father had set himself in 1975, with the particular attention to spacing and depth that the Guardian records specified. The chain link supplemented by the horseshoe wards on the units and the lodge, and the 4 iron posts his father had driven deep into the ground at the corners of the property. Posts that were not visible above ground, and that Frank had located with a probe when he took over the watch. Just to confirm they were where the records said they were. He had been walking this fence line alone for a decade. He walked it now with Herald McKinnon on his left side, and the difference between the 2 walks was apparent from the first few yards. Herald read the fence the way Frank read the horseshoes. Differently. Where Frank read for temperature and resonance, the baseline data that the iron gave a trained hand at close proximity, Herald read something Frank had no name for. Not the iron. Something beneath the iron, in the ground itself, in the air, in the hollow's specific character. He moved with his hands at his sides, and his attention turned inward, in a way that was not distraction, but deep focus, the kind of focus that excluded the surface in order to operate at the level beneath it. He stopped at the east fence twice. Both times he crouched and put his hand flat on the ground between the grass and the fence post, and held it there, not at the iron, at the earth. Frank watched him do this and filed the information without commenting on it. At the south fence, Herald stopped and did not move. This was the corner of the property closest to the Naking Creek corridor, where the creek came around the bend south of the property line and ran east along the property boundary for 60 yards before curving away south again. The creek was audible here, its full water level low in the bed, the sound of it a constant low background. Herald stood at the south fence line and looked not at the fence or the creek, but at the ground between them. The 6 feet of compressed earth that ran along the outside of the fence line. The strip of ground that was part of the hollow's geography, but not part of Ironwood's protection. He stood there for a long time. Frank stood beside him and waited. The creek ran south of the fence. The hollow lay on all sides, the November trees bare, the pale sky showing through. A crow landed on the fence post 20 yards east and sat there without making any sound, which Frank noticed because crows in the hollow were rarely quiet, and then the crow lifted away and the fence post was empty. "The creek corridor," Herald said. "Yes." "How long has it been running wrong?" Frank looked at the water visible through the fence wire, moving slow in its bed. "Since late summer," he said. "I noticed it in August. The character of the sound, the way it was running fast at times when there was no rainfall to account for it. I put it in the record." "The record?" "My father kept a record of the hollow's behaviors. I've continued it. 22 years of accumulated observations." "I want to see that record," Herald said. "Yes." Herald crouched at the fence. He looked at the creek for a long moment without speaking. Then he put his hand on the fence post, the iron of it, and held it there. The post was one of his father's original corner markers, driven in 1975, 13 years of the hollow's weight against it. Frank had tested it every season for 10 years. He knew what it felt like under a trained hand. The look that moved across Herald's face when he touched the post was brief. He controlled it quickly and completely, the way a man controls a reaction he had prepared to have, but is surprised by anyway when it arrives. He took his hand off the post and stood. He did not say what he had read there. He turned back toward the lodge, and Frank walked beside him in silence, and the creek moved south of the fence in its wrong fast way, the water pressing against the channel with a purposefulness that water in that bed should not have had in November. "There is something in the creek corridor," Herald said, when the fence line was behind them. "Not a creature, not in the sense of the Grayson creature, or the manifestations you've documented in the compound. Something foundational. Something that has been using the water table as a conductor for longer than this property has had wards on it, and is now conducting with a specific direction." Frank said, "Conducting toward what?" "Toward the compound," Herald said. "Toward the lodge, toward the specific location of the ward that was erased in October." Frank took this in. "It knows where it killed the ward," he said. "It remembers what it touched," Herald said. "That is consistent with what I know of it. It does not forget the things it has touched." They walked back to the lodge without speaking. Frank made fresh coffee. Chapter 1, Scene 5, The First Night. The hollow had its own relationship with dark. Frank had lived with this long enough to understand that its die. It was not the absence of light, it was the presence of dark, the quality of it, the way it occupied the hours between last light and first light. Daytime dark, in a windowless room, sat still. The hollow's dark had opinions about the space it filled. The hollow's dark was not merely light removed. It was something that occupied the space where light was not, and had opinions about the occupation. He had stopped being frightened by it in year 4. Fear was not useful at this scale, and he had trained it to become watchfulness instead, which was useful, and which had served him for 6 years since. He watched the hollow's dark the way he watched the horseshoes, for deviation from baseline, for the thing that was wrong that had not been wrong the night before. Tonight he watched from the front room. Herald sat across from him, the lamp between them, a cup of coffee on the end table beside his chair. He had taken the coat off finally, around 8 in the evening, after the lamp was lit and the hollow was fully dark outside the windows. He sat in the chair like a man who had done this before, not relaxed, not tense, settled into a watchfulness he could hold all night without effort. The lamp was the only light in the lodge. Frank preferred this. The hollow read light the way it reads sound, as information, and he had learned through the years that a lodge that showed minimal light from the outside was a lodge that the hollow's inhabitants registered differently than one that showed multiple light sources. He could not explain the mechanism. He had the observation and had acted on it, and the acting on it had been consistently correct, and he required nothing more from an observation than that. At 8:47 the siren sounded. Herald looked up from his coffee. "Every night," Frank said. 8:47, never missed. Herald listened to it rise and fall across the hollow. "What is it?" "Old mill siren, down the road." Frank looked at the window. "Nobody knows why it goes off. It just does." Herald said nothing. When it stopped, he set his cup down and looked at the south window. At 10:30, the temperature in the room dropped. Not dramatically. Not the way it had dropped in October. 5 degrees, perhaps, in the space of 3 minutes. The kind of drop that a man who was not paying careful attention would attribute to a draft from an inadequately sealed window or a dip in the outside air that the lodge's heating hadn't compensated for yet. Frank had been paying careful attention. He looked at Herald. Herald was looking at the south window. The south window faced the direction of the Nakin Creek corridor. The sound that came through it was low, below the threshold of hearing, the way the hollows' sounds so often were, felt in the body before the ear had a name for them. A vibration that Frank felt first in his back teeth and then along the bones of his forearms. Not the wet resonance of the Grayson creature. Not anything he had a file for. A sound that the hollow produced when something was moving through it that did not belong there. A visitor. Herald stood. He did not move toward the window. He stood in the space beside his chair and faced the south window and put both hands at his sides, and Frank watched him from across the room and did not speak. What Herald did next, Frank would spend time thinking about in the weeks afterward. He did not advance. He did not withdraw. He stood exactly where he was, in the lamplight, entirely present in a way Frank had no vocabulary for. Like a landmark. Something fixed and certain that occupied its space without effort and without apology. The sound built. It came to the fence line and stopped, not as if it had hit the fence line, not as if the fence line had turned it back. It stopped the way a thing stops when it realizes the geography ahead of it has changed, when it encounters a variable it did not have when it planned its route. It stopped at the fence line, and it sat there in the dark for 20 seconds, and then it was gone. The sound receding back toward the creek corridor, the way a thing recedes when it has gathered information and has somewhere to take the information. Herald sat down. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold in the temperature drop. He drank it anyway. "What was that?" Frank said. "Something from the creek corridor," Herald said. "Not the dark entity. One of the things it has been conditioning in the hollow, testing the perimeter." He looked at the south window. "It was not expecting 2 of us." Frank thought about this. "Because I've been alone for 10 years. Because you have been alone for 10 years and the hollow's inhabitants have based their approach to this compound's defenses on that fact." Herald set down the cup. "That particular creature has been testing the south fence for some time. It knows the precise response your presence alone produces. Tonight, the response was different." "Different how?" Herald looked at him. "Your presence alone produces something it has learned to account for," he said. "My presence is something it has no data on. There was nothing in the south fence approach to tell it what I am, but there was enough to tell it that the calculation it brought to that fence line tonight was incorrect." "What are you?" Frank said. The question sat between them. Herald looked at the cold coffee cup in his hand. He looked at it for a long moment with the particular stillness of a man who never gives unnecessary answers, deciding whether this one qualified. "Something that has been doing this work in this county since before you were born," he said. "Something that the things in the old places have learned to account for across time, the way they've learned to account for iron and confession, and the particular kind of will that guardian practice develops in the people who maintain it. Something that is not well designed for doing it alone." He set the cup down. "Which is why I am here." Frank looked at him. "The 2 of us together are not what either of us is alone," Herald said. "What that creature felt at the fence line tonight was not the sum of 2 individuals. It was something it has no data on. We want to keep it that way as long as possible. Until we understand what we're working with." "Until we understand what we're working with," Herald said. "Yes." The lamp burned between them. The hollow was quiet outside the windows, its particular November quiet. The bare trees and the cold creek and the dark. Frank's father had kept this watch for decades before him, and his father's father had kept it before that, and the records in the locked cabinet in Frank's study went back further than that, to the guardians who had first understood what Ironwood was positioned to address and had built accordingly. He had inherited the work. He had not inherited enough of the knowledge. "My father's records," Frank said. "You said you wanted to see them." "Tomorrow," Herald said. Tonight, I want to think about the fence line. They sat in the lamplight. The hollow held its peace. Chapter 1, Scene 6. Michael. He asked about the boy in the morning. Not first thing. First thing was the coffee and the compound check. The two of them walking the perimeter in the November light, Herald moving through the walk with the same focused inward attention he'd brought to it the day before. Second thing was the records. Herald at Frank's desk for 2 hours with the locked cabinet open and the stacked journals spread across the surface, working from oldest to most recent, reading in the particular way he read that was not so much reading as absorbing, his eyes moving across the pages steadily without stopping. The way certain readers moved whose relationship to text had been built across enough time that the process was simply faster than it looked. Frank made breakfast. He brought a plate to the desk, and Herald ate without looking up from the journals. At 10 o'clock, Herald closed the most recent journal. He sat for a moment. "Your father suspected the Creek Corridor in 1983, he said. He didn't name it that way, but he was circling it, the February entry. I know the entry. He didn't tell you what he suspected. He died in June of 1978, Frank said. He hadn't written that entry yet." Herald looked at him. "The records go to 1983. I continued them," Frank said, "from where he stopped. His handwriting, then mine." Herald looked at the journal in his hands. He opened it to the February 1983 entry and read it again. He closed it. "I see," he said. He brought the plate to the kitchen and washed it and set it in the rack. Frank was at the window. The compound was quiet outside, the gravel drive, the units in their 2 rows, the pale November light on everything. "Tell me about Michael Anderson," Herald said. Frank turned from the window. Herald was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, the posture of a man who had decided to ask the question and was now waiting for the answer without editing what the wait looked like. Frank said, "You knew about him before I did." "Tell me what you know," Herald said. Frank went to the table and sat down. He looked at his hands on the table surface for a moment. "You're right, sorry. Here's the corrected passage without it. March 1985, he said. Spring maintenance. He came alone. His cousin Samantha sent him, thought he could earn a few dollars clearing down trees. He didn't come because of Ironwood. He came because she asked him to, and he needed something to do over spring break. He stopped. "The zombie siege," Herald said. "The zombie siege," Frank said. "I've written about it. The account is in the 1985 journal. I read it this morning. Then you know what happened. I know what you observed from outside. I know what the boy told you when it was over. I want to know what you concluded." Frank looked out the window. "I concluded that the boy had encountered the hollow at an age when most people who encounter it don't survive it," he said. He was 10 years old in 1977 when his family rented the farmhouse on Maple Grove Road. He was in that house for 6 months before they left. Whatever he encountered there, he didn't tell me all of it, but it marked him. I could see it in the way he moved through the compound during the siege, before and after the manifestation, before and after the confrontation in the maintenance shed. He was frightened. He was also steady in a way that 16-year-old boys who haven't been through something significant are not steady. Herald listened. "After the siege, I thought about writing you," Frank said. "I had your card, my father's card. I'd been carrying it for 7 years by then. I thought about it, and I didn't do it, and I thought about it again in the fall of 1985, and didn't do it, and thought about it in the winter and in the spring, and then your letter arrived." "April of 1985, Herald said. "April of 1985. Frank looked at the table. 4 sentences. "I read it the same day it arrived, and I set it in the desk drawer with your card, and I looked at it every month for 3 years, and did not write back." "And did not write back," Frank said, "because I wasn't certain what writing back would set in motion, and I didn't know enough yet to know if it was the right call." He was 16. He had survived something. He deserved the chance to be not quite 17 without someone deciding on his behalf that his survival had obligations attached to it. He stopped. Herald looked at him. "That is not the only reason," Frank said. "No," Herald said. "I was also not certain I was ready to share the watch with anyone. Frank said. Including him. Including you. He looked out the window. The watch has been mine for 10 years. My father gave it to me, and then he died, and I have been it for a decade. Inviting another person into it means acknowledging that one person has not been enough. I had not been ready to acknowledge that. October changed that, Herald said. October changed that, Frank said. He looked at the table. It came through the fence and killed a ward from inside my lodge. One man is not enough against that. I've known it since October, and I've been sitting with it. Herald moved to the table and sat across from him. He is 20, Herald said. He is working a factory line outside Willow's Bend. He lives with his parents. He has been having dreams he does not tell anyone about for at least 3 years, probably longer. He goes to church on Sundays. He is, as far as any of his community can see, an ordinary young man, living an ordinary life in a small Ohio town. Frank said, "He's not ordinary." "No," Herald said. "He is not ordinary. He is something the Guardian lineage has not produced in living memory, if it has produced it at all. I have been watching him from a distance since 1977, and I do not have a complete accounting of what he is. What I have is the observation of what he has survived, and the understanding that the dark entity came to this hollow in October, specifically to announce that it intends to complete what it started with that boy." Frank was quiet. "We need to bring him in," Herald said. The words sat between them. Frank looked at his hands. He thought about the boy in the maintenance shed in March of 1985. The way he'd come through the door in the small hours of the morning, hollow-eyed and bloody from a night of fighting, and the way he'd sat down on the floor of the shed and looked at Frank without the look of a boy who had just decided to fall apart, and without the look of a boy who was performing steadiness. The look of a boy who was calculating. "Not yet," Frank said. Herald looked at him. "He's 20 years old," Frank said. "He's working a factory job. He goes to church. He is in the middle of a life that has nothing to do with any of this yet, or he is allowing himself to believe that, and I am not prepared to walk into the middle of that life until I know more than I currently know about what we are walking him into." He met Herald's eyes. "I won't bring him into this until I can tell him something useful. Right now I can't." Herald was silent for a moment. "The creek corridor," Frank said. "The foundation my father suspected. You said there's something in it. Something the dark entity has been using to undermine the Hollow's defenses. We don't know what it is. We don't know how long it's been there. We don't have enough yet to bring that boy into this fight with anything to offer him besides the fact that the fight exists." "He already knows the fight exists," Herald said. "He has known since he was 10. He knows something exists. He doesn't know what it is, or what it wants, or how it operates, or what will be required of him when the confrontation arrives." Frank looked at him steadily. "Do you want to sit across from Michael Anderson and tell him to prepare for something you cannot describe?" Herald was quiet. "Neither do I," Frank said. They agreed on the shape of the problem. They disagreed on the timing. Neither of them expected that to resolve in a single morning. Herald looked out the south window. "The creek corridor," he said. "Start with the creek corridor," Frank said. Herald stood. He went to the window and looked out at the compound in the November light for a moment. The 2 rows of units, the fence line visible at the far end. He did not say that Frank was right. He did not say that Frank was wrong. He stood at the window and looked at the geography of Ironwood Retreat, and his silence had the particular quality that meant he was accepting a position without conceding it, holding the disagreement in reserve, intact, for the moment when the circumstances made returning to it unavoidable. Frank understood this. He had practiced his own version of it for a decade. The morning light moved through the kitchen window in its flat November way, crossing the worn floor. The compound outside was quiet. The creek ran beyond the south fence, wrong fast as it had been for months. Crossing the worn floor, the way light crossed it every November morning, and the compound outside was quiet, and the creek was running beyond the south fence in its wrong fast November way, and the dead horseshoe was above the front door of the lodge where Frank had left it 3 weeks ago. The hollow was watching. Frank could feel it. And in the watching, now, something that had not been there in the weeks since October. Something that was not quite patience and not quite wariness, but occupied the space between them. The Hollow had noticed there were two of them. Frank went to the study to get the records.